There is a particular silence that lives at the top of everything, not the silence of a forest at dawn or the quiet of a house after everyone has gone to sleep. This silence is different. It is heavy, pressurized like the moment before a storm when even the birds know better than to speak. I know this silence well. I have been sitting inside it for 300 years. My name in the old tongue translates roughly to he who devours the light. I chose it myself, which should tell you something about who I was when I was young, the kind of person who thinks a name like that sounds powerful rather than lonely, the kind of person who mistakes fear for respect and dominance for strength. I was, by any reasonable measure, a fool, a brilliant, terrifying, capable fool, which is perhaps the most dangerous kind. I was not born a demon lord, that matters. People tend to forget that about those of us who hold power over darkness. They imagine we emerged from some crack in the earth, fully formed, crowned in shadow, with cruelty already written into our bones. The truth is more ordinary and because of that more uncomfortable. I was born in a village called Thresh on the eastern edge of what humans now call the Withered Plains. It had a different name then. There were trees. There was a river that ran silver in the mornings. My mother grew herbs in a clay pot on the windowsill. I remember the smell of rosemary when the sun hit it just right. I was the third son of a minor demon clan, low-ranking, overlooked, the kind of family that attends the gatherings of greater powers and stands near the back. My brothers were stronger than me physically, which in a society that valued raw power above almost everything else meant that I was invisible. Not abused, not hated, just quietly, persistently invisible. My father was not cruel. He simply didn't know what to do with a son who read instead of fought, who asked questions instead of obeying, who looked at the hierarchy of our world and saw not a sacred order but a collection of accidents that everyone had agreed to call destiny. I started studying magic at 8 years old in secret because the books I needed were in a restricted part of our clan's small library and I had to pick the lock to reach them. I was not proud of the theft exactly, but I was not ashamed of it either. The knowledge was there, the lock was flimsy. It seemed absurd to let one stop me from reaching the other. That reasoning that the obstacle between me and what I wanted was always the unreasonable thing, never the wanting itself, would serve me very well for a long time, and then destroy everything I loved. By 15, I had surpassed every trained mage in our region. By 20, I had surpassed every trained mage in the continent. The power came easily once I understood the architecture of it, the way magic was not a raw force but a language, and I had always been good with language. I could feel the edges of spells the way a musician hears the wrong note, immediately, instinctively, with a kind of mild offense at the imprecision. I refined everything I touched. I built new techniques where old ones were clumsy. I looked at the limits that other practitioners accepted as permanent walls, and I stepped through them like they were curtains. Success at that scale changes a person, it doesn't change them suddenly. That would be easier to catch, easier to correct. It changes them in small increments, in tiny reframings of reality that each seem perfectly reasonable in the moment. When every obstacle falls before you, you begin to believe that every obstacle should fall before you. When every person you meet is either weaker or afraid, you begin to interpret weakness and fear as the natural condition of others, and your own power as the natural condition of you. You stop being a person who has abilities. You become, in your own mind, an ability wearing the shape of a person. I was 26 when I killed my first rival. His name was Corvan, and he had been systematically destroying the work of younger mages across 3 territories, absorbing their research, taking credit for their discoveries, and leaving them with nothing. By any honest accounting, he was a predator. By any honest accounting, removing him made the world marginally better for dozens of people. I told myself this, I believed it. And the believing was genuine, which is why I didn't notice how much I also simply wanted to remove him, wanted to prove that I could, wanted to see the moment when someone that powerful understood that I was more powerful still. Both things were true, and I only looked at one of them. After Corvan, the progression was what you might expect: other rivals, other obstacles, a war, then another war, then a campaign that lasted 11 years across 4 nations. I was meticulous. I was, compared to many who have held similar power, even restrained in certain ways. I did not torture for pleasure. I did not destroy what could be used. I had rules, or what I called rules, lines I had drawn that I believed separated me from the truly monstrous, not understanding that the presence of the line matters much less than how close you're willing to stand to it. I took my throne at 39. The obsidian citadel, which I had spent 6 years building, was completed 3 months before my campaign ended. I remember walking into the throne room for the first time after the last army had surrendered. The ceiling was 90 feet high. The floor was polished black stone veined with dark red, like something that had once been alive. On every wall, I had commissioned murals depicting key moments of the conquest, not in a triumphant style, but in a documentary one. I had told the artists I wanted honesty, not glorification. Some of them had wept while working. I sat in the throne and the silence arrived. That thick, pressurized silence I mentioned at the beginning. And I remember thinking, not despair, not joy, just a kind of flat, clear-eyed observation, so this is what I built. The throne was not uncomfortable physically. It was cold. Everything in the citadel was cold. I had designed it for impressiveness rather than comfort, for the reaction of people who entered rather than for the experience of the person who lived there. This was perhaps the most honest architectural decision I ever made, because I was, at that point in my life, a person entirely designed for the reaction of others. Every choice I made was filtered through the question of how it would be perceived. So I had built an empire to prove something, and now that the proof existed, I was not sure what to do with the thing I had proven. In those early years on the throne, I was effective. I will not pretend otherwise, because I have enough sins to account for without adding dishonesty to them. I unified trade routes that had been fractured by centuries of smaller conflicts. I reformed the legal systems of the territories under my control, eliminating several categories of punishment that I found gratuitously cruel. I built infrastructure, roads, aqueducts, granaries. My subjects feared me, which meant they also obeyed me, and that obedience, channeled into policy, produced outcomes that improved ordinary lives in measurable ways. A historian looking at the period with no additional context might call it a successful reign. But context exists whether we include it or not. The people I had displaced to build the roads, I did not ask where they went. The communities that had organized their lives around the old trade systems, the small guilds and family operations that collapsed when my centralized networks made them obsolete, I counted them as acceptable losses in the column of progress. The generals who served me were loyal because I rewarded loyalty and made disloyalty catastrophic, which is a functional system for producing obedience and a deeply hollow one for producing anything resembling trust. I had advisors, not friends. I had subjects, not people I knew. My world had become very large and very empty at the same time, and for a long while I was too busy, or too deliberately busy, to sit still long enough to feel it. The first crack came in my 63rd year, small, barely visible. But I have learned in the centuries since that the first crack is always the one that matters. There was a drought in the southern territories. Severe, the kind that comes every generation or so, the kind that the land itself seems to breathe out before recovering. My grain distribution systems should have handled it. On paper, they did handle it, the numbers worked, the supplies moved. But numbers have a way of lying not by being wrong but by being incomplete, and what the numbers didn't capture was the village of Sendra, which had been reclassified during an administrative reorganization the previous year and now fell into a gap between two distribution zones. 43 people died. By the standards of famine, it was a small number. By the standards of something that didn't have to happen, it was 43. I learned about Sendra from a report, a paragraph in a longer document. My secretary at the time, a young demon named Elle with careful handwriting and an extremely poor sense of self-preservation, had circled the paragraph and written in the margin, "Should this be addressed?" I stared at that question for a long time. Should this be addressed? The phrasing bothered me, not whether it was right or just or human, whether it should be addressed. I had built a world where the deaths of 43 people were a question of administrative management. I had built it. Every road and aqueduct and legal reform had been assembled within a structure that produced, as a natural output, the kind of machinery that turned human suffering into paragraphs in longer documents. I fixed the zoning gap. I read the names of the 43 people in Sendra which my office had compiled at my request. I remember sitting with that list for a full evening, not doing anything in particular with it, just sitting with it, as if proximity to the names could substitute for actually having known them. It could not. I knew it could not. But it was the first time I had done something that served no strategic purpose, that communicated no power, that was directed toward no objective except a kind of private reckoning that I didn't yet have the vocabulary for. That was the beginning, not redemption. I want to be careful with that word because the story I'm telling is not a clean one, not a revolution, not a transformation, just a crack. Just a very small beginning of the very long process of a powerful person learning that power is not the same thing as understanding, and that understanding is not the same thing as being good. The throne was cold. Outside the citadel's high windows, the withered plains stretched toward a horizon I had made, and I sat in the silence I had built, and I started very slowly to listen to it. The hardest thing about examining your own cruelty honestly is that almost none of it feels cruel from the inside. Cruelty, as experienced by the person committing it, tends to feel like clarity, like efficiency, like the absence of the sentimentality that clouds other people's judgment. I spent decades believing that my willingness to make hard decisions was a form of courage, a virtue, even something that set me apart from weaker rulers who flinched and hesitated and let mercy become paralysis. I was wrong, but I was wrong in ways that felt, from where I stood, with the information I had chosen to collect, entirely reasonable. Let me tell you about Myra. She was 12 years old when I first noticed her, which is to say she was 12 years old when she did something that entered my awareness, because the noticing of a demon lord and the actual existence of a person are two very different events. She was the daughter of a blacksmith in a market town called Oran's Bridge, a place I passed through exactly once during the late stages of the Eastern Campaign. She had climbed to the top of a water tower to get a better view of my procession, not out of admiration, she told me much later, but out of curiosity, because she had decided that things that scared people were worth looking at directly. She slipped. She didn't fall because one of my generals riding nearby saw her and had the reflexes to catch her with a quick telekinetic spell before she hit the street. I ordered the general to bring her to me, which terrified everyone in her vicinity because being brought to me generally indicated that something had gone wrong. Myra, by her own account, was not terrified. She was annoyed because she had nearly reached a good vantage point, and now she was going to miss the procession entirely. She stood in front of me, 12 years old, dressed dusty, hair chaotic, and before I could speak, she asked whether the general's telekinesis was trained or innate, because she had been reading about the difference and found the mechanical versus organic distinction philosophically interesting. I laughed. I had not laughed in some time. Not a performance laugh, not the kind of laugh you deploy to communicate that you are at ease and therefore others should be afraid. A real laugh, the involuntary kind, that arrived before I had a chance to shape it into anything useful. I arranged for her education, the best tutors in 3 territories, access to the libraries I controlled, a stipend for her family that removed the economic pressure of having a child in full-time study. This was, I told myself, a practical investment. I was always identifying talent, always building the next generation of capable administrators. Which was true, but it was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that I had met a child who looked at frightening things directly and asked good questions, and I wanted to see who she would become. She became extraordinary. Myra studied magic theory, philosophy, administrative science, and history with the kind of appetite that makes teachers feel both proud and slightly alarmed. She wrote papers that her tutors could barely assess because she had moved beyond their expertise within 2 years. She was funny in a precise, quiet way, the kind of funny that requires genuine intelligence because it operates on observation rather than performance. By the time she was 22, she was one of my senior research advisors, and by the time she was 28, she was the person in the Citadel whose opinion I sought most often, because she was the only one who would tell me when she thought I was wrong. And this is where I failed her, not once dramatically, repeatedly in the accumulation of 1,000 small choices. Myra would tell me I was wrong about something, and I would listen and then do the wrong thing anyway, because I had placed her voice in the category of advisors to consider rather than people whose perspective might correct me. I had invited her counsel while fundamentally not believing I needed it. She was a resource I valued rather than a person I trusted, and the distinction between those two things is everything, though it took me a very long time to understand why I kept finding myself on the wrong side of it. The crisis came when I was 91 years old. A rebellion had formed in the Northern Territories, led by a coalition of clan leaders who objected, legitimately, to a land redistribution policy I had implemented to correct what I saw as generational imbalance. The policy was a correction of something unjust. It was also implemented with a speed and bluntness that ignored the complexity of how those territories actually functioned, the relationships between land ownership and cultural identity, the clan systems that weren't purely about economics, the ways that disruption of those systems would create instability that my administrators, looking at maps rather than at communities, had not modeled. Myra had written me a 40-page analysis before the policy was finalized. She had outlined precisely these concerns. She had proposed a modified approach that would achieve the same redistributive goals over 15 years instead of 2, with transitional support structures and genuine consultation with the affected communities. It was meticulous work, and I had read it and I had overridden it because I thought the slower approach was politically fragile, that it would give resistant parties time to organize opposition, that it would be perceived as weakness, that the clean efficiency of a decisive policy was worth the short-term disruption. The rebellion cost more lives than the cautious 15-year plan would have taken in its entirety. The destruction of property and infrastructure in the suppression campaign set the Northern Territories back by decades. And when it was over, the land redistribution had to be modified anyway toward something significantly closer to what Myra had proposed, because the blunt version had created conditions on the ground that made it unworkable. I called her into my study after it was done. The room was quiet. She looked tired in a way I hadn't seen before, not from lack of sleep, but from something more persistent, the particular exhaustion of having been right about something devastating. I should have listened to you, I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something I've turned over in my mind for 200 years. You listened to me, you just didn't believe me. The precision of that distinction hit me somewhere I hadn't expected to be vulnerable. She was right. I had collected her words without receiving them. I had performed the ritual of consultation, reading the analysis, noting her concerns, even remembering specific passages, while remaining in my actual decision-making as sealed off from her perspective as if she had never spoken at all. I had kept her close because she was useful and because, on some level I would not have admitted then, I liked her, but I had never truly opened the part of myself that could be changed by another person's understanding of something I had missed. That part had been closed for so long I had forgotten it was supposed to open. She left the Citadel 3 years later. She told me she was going to open a school in the Eastern Territories, and she told me this with a gentleness that was, I think, deliberate because she understood better than I did how much I depended on her presence and she did not want to wound me more than she had to. She was kind to me even as she left, and I did not deserve that kindness, though I held on to it in the years that followed like something I had borrowed and never returned. Myra is the example I return to most often because she was the one I was most honest with, and even then I failed. But she was not the only one. There was my General Doven, who served me for 40 years with a loyalty that I never adequately named as the gift it was, who died in a campaign I had ordered for strategic reasons that, upon reflection, served my pride more than my empire. There was my Chancellor, Brix, a man of profound administrative genius and personal warmth, whom I systematically stripped of autonomy for years by overriding his decisions until he became careful and small in ways that he hadn't been when I hired him. I did not break him dramatically. I reduced him steadily in tiny delegitimizations until the man who worked for me bore very little resemblance to the man I had recruited. This is the particular cruelty of power exercised without care. It doesn't require malice. It doesn't require anger or contempt. It can operate from a kind of bureaucratic indifference, from the habit of treating people as functions rather than as beings, from the accumulated weight of always being the one whose judgment prevails. The people around me became shadows not because I deliberately blocked the light, but because I never thought to check whether it was reaching them. I occupied so much space that there was simply not enough left for others to fully exist in. I think about them, Myra, Doven, Brix, and the many others whose names I should have learned more carefully, and I try to practice something that does not come naturally to me, the genuine acknowledgement that I am not the center of the story I am telling. Each of them had a life that extended far beyond the moments they spent in proximity to my power. Myra's school became one of the most respected institutions in the Eastern Territories. I know this because I have followed it quietly for a century, the way you follow the life of someone you were not good enough to keep. I take no credit for it. Whatever she built in spite of what I was, not because of it. There is a form of accounting that powerful people resist, and it goes like this. The harm you do is not only in the bad things you actively choose, it is also in the good things that didn't happen because of you, the ideas that weren't voiced because people learned not to voice them around you, the decisions that went unmade because someone better than you at making them had been slowly taught to defer. The art and thought and connection that didn't exist because the people who might have made them spent their energy and intelligence navigating your requirements instead of their own. This is a harder ledger to read because it has no entries, only absences. But absences have weight. I know this because I have been sitting with the weight of them for longer than most nations have existed. I was a demon lord who built systems where systems were chaos, who ended wars that would have killed millions more if they had continued, who reformed laws that needed reforming and built roads that needed building. The good is real, and I don't discard it, because honest accounting means including every column. But the good exists alongside the harm rather than erasing it, and the harm lives in the faces of people I made smaller, in the voice of a 28-year-old advisor telling me that listening and believing are not the same thing, in the specific quality of silence that fills a room when someone who trusted you has finally decided to stop. I sat in my cold throne room after Myra left and I thought, what would it take to actually change? Not to become a different kind of demon lord, more strategic, better at consulting, but to actually change, to be capable of the thing I had failed at for almost a century, which is to let another person's understanding matter enough to move you. I didn't have an answer that night. The Citadel's windows were dark, the plains stretched out below me, and everything out there was quiet, and everything in me was something I didn't have a word for yet. Not regret exactly, something more active than regret, more uncomfortable. The feeling of sitting with a question you have spent your entire life too busy to ask. It would take more time. It always takes more time than you think when the thing that needs to change is this close to the center of you. I want to be honest about the timeline because I think there is a tendency in stories of change, in stories of reckoning, to compress the distance between the moment of realization and the moment of transformation. The first crack and the healed surface feel in retrospect close together. They never are. The actual work is long and often unglamorous and frequently interrupted by regression, by the old habits reasserting themselves with a confidence born of decades of practice. I changed slowly. Very slowly. The pace of it is, I think, important to name, because a demon lord who changes overnight is a fantasy, and the reality of slow change, of someone gradually becoming less harmful, through sustained effort and repeated failure and incremental correction, is more honest and more useful than any version that moves faster than it actually did. After Myra left, I spent approximately 6 years being a worse ruler than I had been before. This is not a paradox. The cracking of certainty before it becomes productive often creates a period of instability. I had organized my governance around a set of assumptions about my own judgment, and those assumptions had been comprehensively disproven, and I had not yet built anything to replace them. I was uncertain in ways that I expressed as irritability, as excessive caution followed by reckless decisiveness, as a pattern of consulting advisors more than I ever had, and then dismissing them more sharply than ever when their recommendations conflicted with my impulses. I was a person learning to question himself who had not yet learned to be patient with the questioning. The questioning hurt in a way I hadn't anticipated, a persistent, low-grade discomfort, like learning to use an injured limb, the rehabilitation painful in ways the original damage hadn't been. The thing that helped most, and I did not predict this, I did not choose it intentionally, it arrived as an accident the way the most useful things often do, was boredom. In my 119th year, I developed a persistent illness. Nothing fatal, I am not easily killed, but debilitating enough that I was confined to the Citadel's inner chambers for the better part of 8 months. No campaigns, no formal audiences, no major policy decisions. My council managed the day-to-day administration, and I was left, for the first time in nearly 90 years, with very little to do and a great deal of time to be alone with myself. It was uncomfortable in a way I struggled to fully describe. I had been moving fast for so long that stillness felt actively wrong, felt like something was broken rather than something that simply required adjustment. I read because reading had always been my default mode of filling time, but the texts I had favored, strategic analysis, magical theory, historical accounts of governance, stopped satisfying me in the way they had. I found myself reading things I had not read since my 20s, philosophy, poetry, the kind of writing that sits with questions rather than resolving them. I read a collection of elegies written in the common language of the Western Territories, the kind of verse that working people wrote for each other at funerals, and that no one bothered to collect until a scholar named Fen Orris decided, in a moment of inspired archival impulse, that it mattered. I read those elegies for a week. They were not sophisticated. Many of them were metrically imperfect and imagistically simple, the kind of writing that anyone who had been formally educated in literary craft would not have considered worth preserving. They were about dead farmers and lost children and marriages that lasted 50 years and specific, named, irreplaceable individuals who had done ordinary things and been loved by specific people who had been unable to say everything they felt while those people were still alive. I read them, and something in me that had been sealed for a very long time became, at least partially, open. I wept. I mention this not for dramatic effect, but because it was the first time in approximately 60 years that I had done it, and the experience was disorienting enough that I sat with it for a while, turning it over, trying to understand what I was crying for exactly. It wasn't the elegies themselves, though they were moving. It was the realization, arriving late and fully formed, that every person I had ever counted as a statistic had a parallel text. Every name on that list from Sendra, every soldier who died in the Northern Rebellion, every one of Brix's careful decisions that I had overridden until he stopped being careful and just started being small, every farmer displaced by a road I built without asking whether the road's necessity justified the displacement, or whether both things could have been served simultaneously if I had thought about it longer. I had not thought about it longer. I had been moving fast, and moving fast had felt like a virtue, and I had never understood until I was lying in a sick room reading funeral poetry that the speed was, at least partly, a way of not having to feel what I was doing while I was doing it. The illness lasted 8 months. When I recovered, I was not transformed. I want to be careful about this. Recovery from illness does not remake character. What it gave me was a practice, a forced habit of stillness that I tried with mixed results to maintain after I was mobile and occupied again. I began setting aside time each morning, 1 hour in which I did not govern, did not read strategy, did not prepare for meetings. I sat in whatever room I was in and I thought about specific people, not populations, not territories, not policy outcomes, individual people named whose lives I had touched. I thought about what they might be doing. I thought about whether what I had done for or to them had made their specific existence better or worse. This was not a useful practice in any administrative sense. It had no direct policy output. But it was, I came to understand, the beginning of a different relationship between me and the fact of other people, a relationship in which they were real rather than theoretical, present rather than representative. Around my 140th year, I made a decision that surprised my entire council. I appointed a formal body, 10 individuals drawn from different territories, different social positions, different relationships to my power, and I gave them a specific mandate to tell me what the empire looked like from below, not policy analysis, not strategic recommendation, testimony. What is it like to live in a place I govern? What are the ordinary experiences of ordinary people, and how does the exercise of my power shape them in ways both visible and invisible? I called them the Ground Commission, which my council found slightly undignified as a name. I did not change it. The council found a great many of my decisions in that period undignified, which I took as a reasonable indicator that I was moving in an appropriate direction. The Ground Commission's first report took 8 months to compile. It was 400 pages long, and it contained things I knew and things I hadn't known and things I had known in some abstract sense, but had never allowed myself to know in the specific, embodied way that the testimony of real people makes unavoidable. There was a section about the tax collection process in rural areas that I read 3 times. The efficiency of my tax system, which was genuinely more rational and less corrupt than the systems it had replaced, produced, in its interaction with the actual agricultural cycles of specific regions, a timing problem that meant collectors arrived at the worst possible moment of the year for farmers who operated on narrow margins. Nobody had flagged this to me because it was diffuse, spread across many small situations rather than concentrated in one visible problem, and because the people experiencing it did not have a direct line to my attention. It cost them, in aggregate, an enormous amount. It cost me nothing. I changed the timing. It was a simple fix. It had been a simple fix for 70 years. There were dozens of things like that, maybe hundreds, fixable things that had not been fixed because the experience of the people affected had not been systematically included in the information I was using to govern. I had built an extensive intelligence apparatus to track political threats, military movements, economic trends. I had built essentially nothing to understand the felt experience of daily life in my territories. The asymmetry was not ideological. I had not decided that felt experience didn't matter. I had simply never thought about it, which is a different failure, more ordinary and more systemic, and more characteristic of the way power makes certain questions invisible by never requiring them to be asked. My council adapted. Some of them adapted with genuine enthusiasm because good administrators, it turns out, are often frustrated by the gap between policy design and policy experience, and giving them a mechanism to understand that gap was something many of them had quietly wanted for a long time. Others adapted because I was the demon lord and adaptation was not entirely optional. I tried not to take too much comfort from either group's compliance, because compliance was still the operating mode, and I was still the source of authority, and nothing about that structural reality had changed. I had simply begun to use the authority differently. This is the thing about power that I wish I had understood at 30 instead of at 140. The possession of it is not in itself the problem. The problem is what it does to the information available to you, to the feedback systems you depend on to understand what you are doing. Power tends to filter the world into a shape that confirms its own decisions, because the people around power have incentives to provide confirming information, and because powerful people have incentives to seek information that feels like reassurance. The work of governing well, I use well carefully, knowing its limits, is largely the work of building structures that actively resist this tendency, of creating mechanisms for receiving bad news rather than just tolerating it when it arrives, of seeking out the perspective that will not naturally reach you because reaching you is expensive and frightening, and the people most affected are often the least positioned to make the journey. I built more of those mechanisms. Not all at once. The Ground Commission was followed by other changes slowly over decades, each one preceded by the kind of internal argument I had learned to have with myself. The old voice that said this is inefficient, this is weakness, this opens you to exploitation, and the newer voice that said those objections are real but they are not the only consideration, and you have spent too long treating them as if they were. I listened to both voices. I acted increasingly on the basis of the second. In my 190th year, I wrote a letter to Myra, not to her school, to her directly, at the home she had maintained in the eastern city of Vel since her retirement. She was 204 years old, which for her species was elderly but not yet at the end, and I had no guarantee she would receive me, no guarantee she had any interest in correspondence with the person who had failed her so thoroughly a century and a half before. She wrote back 3 pages in handwriting that had grown more deliberate than I remembered. She did not forgive me, the letter did not contain forgiveness, and I had not asked for it, understanding that forgiveness is not a debt owed to regret, however sincere. But she answered my letter. She told me about the school. She told me about her students, 3 of whom had gone on to careers in governance in the Eastern Territories, carrying with them, she said with a precision that I recognized and loved, an approach to administrative decision-making that she described as suspicious of elegant solutions to complex problems. She asked me what I had been reading. We began a correspondence that continued until her death 27 years later. Those letters are the things I return to most often in the 300 years of silence I mentioned at the beginning, not the policies, not the reforms, not the roads and the legal codes and the grain distribution systems. The letters from Myra in which she was honest with me because she had decided on her own terms and in her own time to extend me that credit. The things she said about her students. The things she asked about mine, because in my 150th year I had begun, tentatively, to teach small seminars in administrative theory, nothing grand, but the beginning of the practice of passing things forward rather than only accumulating them. Regret, I learned, is not a destination. It is not the end of the accounting, the place you arrive and remain once the moral mathematics have been completed. It is a practice, the repeated return to the question of how things were and how they might have been and what the distance between those two realities cost the specific people who lived in it. I return to Sendra. I return to the Northern Rebellion. I returned to the sight of Doven's face on the last day I saw him, when I gave him an order I should not have given, and he said, "Yes, my lord," in the voice of someone who has learned that saying anything else is not a real option. I return to these things not as punishment, not in the mode of self-laceration that is its own kind of narcissism. I return to them the way you return to an instrument you are still learning to play, with the attention that keeps the skill from atrophying, with the understanding that the learning is not completed, that there is no point at which you have grieved sufficiently and can stop, because sufficiency is not the right frame. The right frame is sustained awareness. The right frame is keeping the knowledge of what you cost others alive, present, specifically real, so that the decisions you make today are made by someone who knows exactly what careless decisions produce. I was a slow learner, I want to name that plainly, 300 years, and I am still learning, still returning, still finding moments in which the old patterns reassert themselves and have to be recognized and corrected. Progress is real, but it is not linear. The work of becoming less harmful is ongoing in a way that completion does not describe. I am not finished. I do not expect to be finished. I have, I think, finally stopped wanting that finishedness as urgently as I once did, the desire to have arrived at the better version of myself, to be done with the difficulty of the becoming. I am still becoming. The citadel is quieter now than it was. Outside, the plains have changed, not to what they were before I remade them, but to something different again, something that has grown in the last century while I governed more carefully. There are things growing out there that I did not plant. I consider that a beginning. 300 years. That is where I sit now, in the late morning of what my calendar describes as the 302nd year of my rule, though rule has come to mean something so different from what it meant in the beginning that I sometimes wonder if the word still applies, or if I am holding onto it out of habit, the way you hold onto the name of a place that has completely changed around you. The obsidian citadel is still standing. I rebuilt portions of it 3 times over the centuries, not the structure itself, but the interior, the way space is used, what it is for. The throne room that I designed for impressiveness, with its 90-foot ceiling and its polished black stone and its murals of conquest, is now a library. The throne is still there, pushed to one side, kept because removing it entirely felt like a kind of dishonesty about the history of the place, but surrounded now by shelves and reading tables, and on most days a few dozen students from the academic programs I have funded in the adjacent city. They sometimes sit on the steps of the old throne to read, which I think is exactly right. I still govern, the territories are still mine in the technical sense, and I have not divested myself of the authority that came with conquest, because I am honest enough with myself to know that a dramatic abdication at this point would be more about my own comfort, the desire to stop being the person responsible, than about what would actually serve stability in the region. The infrastructure of 2 centuries of administration does not hand itself off cleanly to an alternative structure just because the person at the top decides they are done. There are commitments to honor, systems to maintain, transitions to manage responsibly rather than romantically. I owe that to the people in these territories. I owe them the boring, unglamorous work of orderly governance even when what I would prefer is the cleaner narrative of the demon lord who laid down his power and walked away. So I govern, but the work of governing now is mostly the work of listening, of reviewing, of asking questions that invite correction rather than confirmation, of stepping back when stepping forward would only add weight where weight is not needed. My council operates with significant autonomy. The regional administrators operate with more. The Ground Commission, now in its 4th generation of members, a permanent institution rather than an experiment, produces reports that I read completely and that routinely contain things I was wrong about, which I have come to experience not as defeat but as function. The system working as intended. I am not beloved. I want to be accurate about this because I think there is a temptation in accounts of this kind to arrive eventually at a version of the powerful person who has worked hard enough and learned enough and made enough repairs that the people who feared them can finally love them. That is a satisfying story. It is not my story. There are people in these territories for whom I am the demon lord who conquered their grandparents' world, and no amount of administrative reform or subsequent justice undoes the fact of the conquest. They are right, the conquest happened, the harm of it is not erased by what came after. I do not ask them to feel differently about me than they do because I think their feelings are honest and earned, and I have no right to manage them into something more comfortable for my own sense of self. What I have tried to do imperfectly, slowly, with more backsliding than I care to catalogue, is govern in a way that serves them regardless of whether they like me, because their benefit does not have to depend on their gratitude, and my responsibility does not diminish if their gratitude is absent. This is something I had to learn, that doing right by people is not a transaction in which good outcomes must be acknowledged and returned in kind. It is a practice that exists entirely independent of reception. I do the work because it is the work. Whether it changes anyone's opinion of me is genuinely not the point. Though I will admit alone in the quiet of the mornings that it sometimes still feels like the point, the desire for absolution is stubborn, the desire to have paid the debt, to have done enough good that the harm is somehow balanced, to have the accounting close in your favor, this desire does not go away simply because you understand it is not how morality works. Understanding and feeling are different things, and they operate on different timescales. I understand that I cannot earn back the 337 lives lost in the Northern Rebellion through any subsequent virtue. I understand this clearly. I still on certain nights make the calculation, I catch myself making it, I put it down, I pick it back up. This is the ongoing nature of it, the part that is not resolved, that will not be resolved, that I suspect I am meant to carry rather than set down. Last spring, a young scholar came to the Citadel to conduct research. She was writing a history of the conquest period, specifically examining the social structures of the pre-conquest clans and how they had or hadn't survived integration into my administrative system. She was, by any reasonable assessment, working on research that was at minimum critical of my early governance and potentially quite damning. She had requested access to the Citadel archives through official channels, and the request had been approved without reaching me. My archivists no longer flag requests based on whether the topic might be embarrassing. because I changed that policy about 80 years ago after realizing what the policy was actually accomplishing. I met her by accident in the library that used to be the throne room. She was sitting at one of the long reading tables with 3 boxes of documents around her, making notes in a cramped, fast handwriting that reminded me of Myra's early work. Her name was Sefer, and she was from the Eastern Territories, from a clan family that had been directly affected by the Northern Rebellion. She did not know who I was when I sat down at the same table. I look apparently like a moderately senior official on unremarkable days. I did not identify myself. I asked what she was researching. She told me, with the directness of someone whose work has given her the right to be unembarrassed about it, she told me that she was trying to understand the human cost of rapid administrative integration, the ways in which the efficiencies of centralized governance had been achieved through the disruption of systems that people depended on, and how those disruptions had propagated through generations in ways that the administrative record didn't capture because the administrative record was not designed to capture them. Who do you think was most responsible for that? I asked, not a test, genuine curiosity about how she framed it. She considered for a moment in the way of someone who has actually thought about a question rather than just acquired a position on it. The demon lord bears the structural responsibility, she said, but I think the more interesting question is what made it possible. What were the conditions that allowed a ruler to make decisions at that scale without encountering the feedback that would have corrected them? That's a systems problem, not just a character problem. Character is part of it, but character alone doesn't produce consequences that large. I thought about this for the rest of the day, a systems problem. She was right, and she was also offering me something I hadn't expected, a frame in which my failures were real and not diminished, but also located within a structure larger than my individual choices, a structure that implicated the way power is organized, the way information flows or doesn't, the way the tools we give rulers tend to amplify certain inputs and eliminate others. I was responsible for the specific choices I made within that structure. I was also one instance of a recurring pattern, and understanding the pattern was not absolution, but it was information that could be useful to someone who wanted to build differently. I told her who I was eventually, at the end of the day as she was packing her notes. Her face did the thing faces do when a significant thing becomes suddenly real, a moment of readjustment, a recalculation of the conversation that had just happened, a flicker of something that was probably fear before she managed it into composure. I should tell you, she said after a pause, that some of what I'm going to write is going to be very critical of your early governance. I know, I said. I'd like to read it when it's done if you're willing to share it. She looked at me for a long moment. Whatever she was assessing, she seemed to reach a tentative conclusion. I'll consider it, she said. I walked back through the building after she left, through the corridors I had designed for intimidation and redesigned over centuries for use, past the offices where my council worked and the rooms where students slept when they came for the residential seminars, past the window that looks out over the eastern portion of the withered plains toward the distant smudge where the city of Vel sits, where Myra's school still operates and where somewhere, presumably, the next generation of administrators is learning to be suspicious of elegant solutions to complex problems. I stood at that window for a while. The plains are not entirely withered anymore. There are sections to the south that have been actively restored over the past century, the result of a long conservation effort that one of my regional administrators proposed about 40 years ago, and that I had initially been skeptical of because the resources required seemed disproportionate to the direct economic benefit. She made the case 3 times, each time more specifically, until I finally understood what I had been failing to understand, that the economic benefit calculation was the wrong unit of analysis, that there were kinds of value that the calculation didn't capture, that the restoration of something damaged has worth that doesn't resolve neatly into productivity metrics. That the relationship between an inhabited world and the people who inhabit it is more complicated and more important than I had been treating it. She made the case 3 times because I was slow. I was always slow. But she made it again, and I listened eventually in the way that Myra had distinguished from merely hearing, with the part of me that could actually be moved. There is a tree visible from this window about 2 miles out on the plains. It is large, which means it is old, which means it predates the conquest and everything I did to this landscape in my first century of ruling it. It has survived because it is far enough from any road or settlement that there was no practical reason to remove it. I look at it often, this tree that exists entirely without reference to my decisions, that grew according to its own nature and timing, that is simply there, specific and alive, asking nothing of me. I am 302 years old. I have been the most powerful being in this region for most of that time. I have built and destroyed and rebuilt. I have made decisions that shaped the lives of millions of people, some better, some worse, some in ways I will never fully know because the knowing requires access to experience I can only approximate from the outside. I have been wrong in enormous ways and in tiny ways and in ways that were both at once. I have learned slowly and incompletely and with a consistency of backsliding that I no longer treat as a crisis, because crises require resolution, and this is simply a condition. What do I know then after all of it? I am reluctant to convert it into lessons because the conversion tends to smooth out the rough parts, to make the difficulty look like a curriculum rather than a life. But I can say what I notice, what keeps being true, what keeps returning when the silence is long enough to let me actually hear. I notice that every mistake I made with consequences I still carry was preceded by a moment in which someone tried to give me information I hadn't asked for, and I chose, sometimes consciously, sometimes not, to not fully receive it. Myra writing 40 pages I read without believing. Doven showing me in the set of his shoulders that the order I was about to give was not one he could endorse. Sefer's great-grandparents, living in the disrupted ruin of a system that my policy reports described as successfully integrated. The information was there. I had built myself into someone who could handle information strategically but not be genuinely reached by it. I notice that the things that have made the most difference, the Ground Commission, the Archive Access Policy, the Conservation Program, the change in how my council operates were not dramatic, they were structural. They were changes to how information moves rather than declarations of a new approach. Transformation of character matters, but character operating within unchanged systems produces only incremental improvement. The system has to change, and the system changes when you build mechanisms that require the information you would otherwise not receive to actually arrive. I notice that the silence at the top of everything, which I described at the beginning 300 years ago in my memory as heavy and pressurized, has a different quality now. It is still there. Power is still isolating, but in the gaps in the silence there are now voices I have actually invited, the scholar making the case for the 3rd time, the student sitting on the steps of the old throne, the archivists flagging nothing, the Ground Commission reporting on the specific texture of a life I do not live. The silence hasn't disappeared, but it is interrupted more often, and the interruptions are the point. And I notice this last thing, which is perhaps the hardest to say plainly, that I am still here, still the demon lord, still the person who holds authority over this territory, still the person whose decisions shape lives in ways that cannot be fully mapped. I have not found a way out of that. I have tried to find ways to hold it responsibly, to exercise it with the kind of sustained attention to consequence that I did not bring to it for the first century of my life. But the authority is still here, and I am still the one who has it. That is not comfortable. I suspect it is not supposed to be. The discomfort is probably the most honest thing about my current situation, the ongoing awareness that power does not stop being power because the person holding it has become more thoughtful, and that thoughtfulness is real and insufficient in equal measure. I do not get to step outside this. I have tried to become worthy of what I hold, knowing that worthiness is not a fixed state, not an accomplishment, not something you achieve and then rest in. It is a practice, like stillness, like listening, like the daily work of returning to specific faces and asking whether what I am doing today honors what they cost. Outside the window, the tree on the plains catches the afternoon light. It does not know I am watching it. It does not need to. It is simply there, growing in the direction of what it needs, as it has been growing for longer than I have held power, as it will continue growing when I no longer do. There is something in that not consolation exactly, but company. The world does not require my attention to continue. It has its own commitments, its own long projects, its own slow accumulation of something that will outlast the obsidian citadel and everything inside it. I find that I am glad of this. It took me a very long time to be glad of it, to feel the existence of things beyond my influence as relief rather than irrelevance. But I am glad of it now. The afternoon is quiet. There is work to do, there is always work to do, but it can wait 20 more minutes. I stand at the window with the light on the glass and the plains spread out beyond it and the tree standing in the middle of everything, belonging only to itself, and I breathe in and breathe out and I think about who I was and who I have become and the enormous, immeasurable distance between the two, which is real and hard won and still not enough. Still not enough and still worth continuing.